All right, so this is our second literary theory, reader response criticism. Reader response critics are concerned primarily with the actual reading process. They ask questions about how do readers construct meaning through reading or decoding the text. There are three primary components to this process: the reader, the text, and the meaning. So W.H. Auden once said, "What a poem means is an outcome of a dialogue between the words on the page and the person who happens to be reading it. That is to say, its meaning varies from person to person." Contrary to new criticism, reader response critics believe that the reader cannot be omitted from the meaning-making process. Second, readers do not passively consume a predetermined meaning presented to them in an objective literary text. Rather, they actively make the meaning they find in literature. This is known as the transactional experience. Reader response criticism is transactional rather than interactional. So rather than just a meeting between two things, an interaction, readers get something out of the text and the text gets something out of the readers, a transaction. So while the reader extracts a meaning from the text in turn elicits emotions, memories, judgments, and possibly actions from the reader. In this way, the text acts as a stimulus for eliciting experiences, thoughts, and ideas from the reader, while simultaneously the text shapes the reader's experiences by selecting, limiting, and ordering the ideas that best conform to the text. Through this transactional experience, the reader and the text produce a new creation, the interpretation or meaning of the poem, as Louise Rosenblatt called it. The reader brings his or her ideology to the transaction. Ideology is defined as the personal set of beliefs that form your worldview. Charles Bressler describes this worldview as including background, purpose for reading, knowledge of the world, knowledge of words, etc., as well as many other factors such as your race, gender, sexual orientation, your religious beliefs, your political beliefs, and your socioeconomic status. Through the exchange of ideas between the reader and the text, meaning is created so that the reader can make sense of the printed material. Louise Rosenblatt argues that literary experience is a synthesis of what the reader already knows and feels, their ideology, with what the literary text has to offer. So, one problem with ideology, however, is that it can enable us to make a symbolic leap. Symbolic leaps occur when we falsely construe an image found in the text as a symbol, and without any textual evidence, develop an interpretation based on that symbol. When we connect to symbols that simply aren't present, we create false meanings. This misinterpretation can be valuable, however. If you can figure out why it happened, it might help you understand yourself better, but not the text you're supposed to be analyzing. This is still literary theory, and it must be based in fact, even if that fact is somewhat subjective. Some reader response critics believe that texts are pre-structured to guide us through the processes involved in interpreting by projecting meaning onto the different texts. The text brings its various linguistic elements, such as characterization, plot, figurative language, etc. Because of the structure of the text, its inherent signs and symbols or literary devices that have pre-established and accepted interpretations, the reader is guided to a somewhat predetermined meaning. Deborah Appelman describes this part of the transaction as the text not embodying meaning, but rather guiding the active creation of meaning. Therefore, the meaning of the text does not consist of the final conclusion we draw about what the text says. That is, what we think the text means isn't really that important, but rather the meaning of the text consists of our experience of what the text does to us when we read it. That is, the text only means what responses, emotional, intellectual, or psychological, we have when we read it. Lois Tyson explains that pre-structuralization allows us to create a conceptual or symbolic world in our mind as we read. Therefore, when we interpret the meaning of a text, we're actually interpreting the meaning of the conceptual experience we created in response to the text. Deborah Appelman argues that the literary text is simply symbols on a page, and the literary work exists only in the interaction between the reader and the text. So, in order to make sense of this and write our analysis of a text without writing about ourselves, we have to use response analysis statements. There are 3 basic steps in the process. First, you must characterize your response to the text as a whole. Are you drawn to a particular character? Did the text evoke a particular emotion? Second, you must support your response with actual evidence. What specific scenes, quotes, images generated which specific responses? Third, you must determine why these responses occurred. What in your ideology caused your reaction? Tyson argues that the goal here is for you to understand your responses, not merely report them or make excuses for them. For reader response critics, a response analysis statement is a thorough, detailed explanation of the relationship among specific textual evidence, specific personal responses, and the meaning the text has for the student as a result of his or her encounter with it. You do need to make sure not to confuse a text's representation of a particular human behavior with the text's endorsement of that behavior. So just because a text uses profanity or the N-word, it does not mean that the author, text, or course requiring that text endorses that behavior or ideology. Most texts use disturbing images and behaviors and language in order to expose them to public scorn and hopefully elicit some change, either socially or individually. However, because of this, we need to be aware that our judgment of a text's attitude, especially towards sensitive issues such as race, gender, sexual orientation, class, etc., will probably be strongly influenced by our own ideologies and cause us to project onto the text our own personal belief or experience, which is not inherent in the text itself. So, what the theory is. The theory is the reader plus the text equaling its meaning. It's about using the experience of reading in order to create meaning, and then using textual evidence to explain an effect the text has on the reader. And it's about understanding yourself, your worldview, and your reaction to the texts. What the theory is not. So it's not using just your personal or emotional preference to derive the meaning. It's not making excuses for characters or actions in a text based on your past experience. And it's not making excuses for your own reactions. And most of all, it is not writing solely about yourself. This has been a lecture on reader response criticism. Thanks for listening.